The overhead light in the cage flickered twice before it steadied, and Claire Duvall did not look up. She had learned, over 11 years in the evidence room of the Dellacroix Parish Sheriff's Department, to ignore the things she could not control. The light would hold or it would not. She kept her eyes on the inventory sheet. Row J, Shelf 14, Box 7 of 9 in the Marcus Darnell Teal case file. The box was taped. Property tape, manila-colored, with a serial number stamped in red ink across the seam. She cut it with her box knife the way she always did, one clean stroke, then a half stroke to release the flap and set the tape aside on the gray metal cart. The room smelled the way it always smelled. Gun oil, old cardboard, the industrial citrus of the cleaning solution they used on the floors every Thursday, and underneath all of it, something undefinable and slightly animal, the accumulated residue of every bad thing that had ever passed through the building. She pulled out the inventory sheet from the front pocket of the box. It was a standard 21B form, carbon copy, the pink sheet still attached to the white. The case number was 2019-04CR0882. She scanned the items. 1 Nokia cellular telephone, black model TA1053 IMEI noted. 1 nylon wallet, brown, containing Louisiana State ID MasterCard debit card, $22 cash. 1 set keys, 3-key ring with a Chilean keychain. 1 styrofoam cup, partial contents. 1 small plastic bag, clear, 3.1 grams marijuana. Miscellaneous clothing items, itemized on sheet 2. She checked the box. The wallet was there, sealed in a clear evidence bag. The keys, the cup, the marijuana in its bag, the clothing in a larger bag, sealed and labeled. She looked back at the inventory sheet. No phone. She looked in the box again, lifting the clothing bag carefully, checking underneath it, then behind the larger items. Nothing. She looked at the interior walls of the box to see if a bag had been rubber banded to a wall. It happened sometimes with smaller items. Nothing. She wrote on her clipboard, Box 79, Nokia Cellular, TA1053, logged at intake, not present at audit. Date, March 4, 2024. She set the clipboard on the cart and reached back into the box to stack everything for resealing, and that was when her fingers touched something in the far back right corner. A shape she hadn't seen because it was tucked behind the fold of the clothing bag. She pulled it out. It was a phone. But it wasn't the Nokia. It was a Samsung, a Galaxy A12 black, older model, no case, and it had no evidence bag. No seal, no label, no chain of custody tag, nothing. Just the phone sitting loose in the box like someone had dropped it there by mistake or by design or both. Claire stood there for a moment, holding it at arm's length. The fluorescent light buzzed above her. She put the phone in a fresh evidence bag, sealed it, wrote the box number, the shelf, the date, and her initials on the label. Then she sealed the box without finishing the rest of the audit, wheeled the cart to the loading area, locked it under her name, and walked out of the cage. She did not tell anyone, not yet. Dellacroix, Louisiana sits 40 miles northwest of Baton Rouge in a bowl of land that collects heat the way an old pot collects grease, slowly, thoroughly, and without apology. The summers there are biblical. April through October the air has texture, you breathe it and you feel it going in, warm and damp, clinging to your sinuses. The bayou runs along the eastern edge of the town proper, slow and dark green, almost black in certain light. Herons stand in the shallows with the patience of very old men. It was a Tuesday in early March when Claire found the phone. The temperature that morning had been 54 degrees, which counted as cold in Dellacroix. By noon it would be 68. She drove home at 5:15 along Route 18, windows cracked, radio off, and when she pulled into the driveway of her house, a pale yellow shotgun style on Beaumont Street, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a carport she never parked in because it had become a repository for everything she hadn't dealt with since her divorce. She sat for 4 minutes before getting out. She went inside and made a pot of coffee she didn't need and sat at her kitchen table and thought about Marcus Teal. She had been working the evidence room in April of 2019. She remembered the case not because of its particulars, but because of the way the building changed in the week after. Voices dropped. People stopped making eye contact in the hallways. The kind of institutional silence that only descends when something has gone wrong enough that no one wants to be associated with having known about it. Marcus Darnell Teal was 23 years old. He'd been a pre-med student at Southern University for 2 years before his mother's insurance ran out, and he came back to Dellacroix and started working at a crawfish processing plant on the edge of the parish. On April 9, 2019 at 11:43 p.m., he was shot twice by Deputy Calvin Jourdain during a traffic stop on Hatcher Road. The official account was that Teal had reached under his seat for what Jourdain described as a dark object consistent with a firearm. No weapon was found in the vehicle. The marijuana in his possession, 3.1 grams, was the only contraband. The department's internal review conducted by Lieutenant Roy Gaudet of the Criminal Investigations Division cleared Jourdain of wrongdoing within 36 days. The DA declined to bring charges. Teal's mother, Doretha, had stood on the courthouse steps at the press conference with a photograph of her son in a clear plastic sleeve, his Southern University ID photo, lanyard visible, smiling, and said almost nothing. She didn't cry. She stood there with the photo until the reporters left. Claire had watched it on the local news in her living room. She'd thought, that poor woman, then she'd thought about something else. That was 5 years ago. Now she sat at her kitchen table and thought about the phone in the evidence box that had no business being there, and she thought about the phone that should have been there and wasn't. She thought about the chain of custody form and what it meant that the phone had been replaced, not removed, replaced with something untethered to the case. She thought about the career she'd built in that building. Her son, Devlin, was a junior at LSU. She thought about his tuition. She poured the coffee down the drain and went to bed at 8:30 and lay in the dark for 2 hours before she slept. Roy Gaudet had a way of filling a room without raising his voice. It wasn't size, he was maybe 5'11", not particularly broad, it was bearing. The way he stood in doorways, leaning his shoulder against the frame with his arms crossed, watching whoever was inside with the mild, unrushed attention of a man who has all the time in the world and knows it. He'd been on the force for 26 years. He had a plaque in his office from the governor's office, a commendation from the DEA, and a shadow box on the wall with challenge coins from 3 different federal task forces. His hair was iron gray and cut close. He didn't eat lunch at his desk. He ate in the break room, and he always refilled the coffee pot when he emptied it, which was a thing people noticed. People in the department talked about Gaudet the way they talk about weather, not whether it's good or bad, but what to expect from it. He's fair, he's thorough, he doesn't forget a thing. He does right by his people as long as his people do right by him. The last part always got added like a rider to a bill. He had recommended Claire for her current position, as a matter of fact. Back in 2012, when the property room supervisor retired and the sheriff at the time was looking to fill it without posting it publicly, Gaudet had put her name forward. She'd been a clerk in records for 3 years by then. He'd said, she's quiet, she's careful, she doesn't mix in things that aren't her business. She found this out later from a woman who no longer worked there. She'd never been sure how to feel about it. On Wednesday morning, 2 days after finding the phone, Claire arrived at work at 7:40. She signed in on the time sheet and went to the evidence room and unlocked the cage and started her routine. Thursdays were audit days. Wednesday was for incoming intake, chain of custody updates, court-ordered destructions. She had 4 items to destroy: marijuana from a closed case, 2 knives from a weapons charge that had resolved, and she completed those first, photographing each item, filling the destruction log, putting the bags in the red bin. She did all of this with her normal level of attention. She did not pull the cart with the teal box out from storage. The Samsung phone she'd bagged the night before was in a locked drawer in her desk. She'd put it there after photographing it with her personal phone from 6 different angles: the make, model, the missing label, the visible scratches on the corner, the cracked screen protector. Those photos were now in an email draft she had not sent, sitting on a Gmail account she created under a name that wasn't hers, from the browser on her kitchen laptop. At 9:15, Gaudet came in. He came in maybe once a week, sometimes less. He'd retrieve something he needed for a case or come to verify an item for court. He didn't come to chat. He knocked on the cage door, which was the protocol. The cage required a second person to sign for anything, and Claire buzzed him in. "Morning," he said. "Morning. I've got a chain of custody pull for the Pridox case. Case number 2022 CR1190, firearms." She pulled it without comment. 2 Glocks, a Mossberg, and a box of .40 caliber ammunition, all sealed and tagged. She brought them on the cart to the table inside the cage, and Gaudet signed the retrieval log and took photos of each item on his department phone. She watched him the way she'd always watched him, at an angle, not directly. He was methodical. He photographed the tags, the seals, the items themselves, and then he looked up and caught her looking. "How's Devlin?" he asked. "He's good, taking his LSATs in June." "Law school," he nodded, not impressed, not dismissive. "Smart kid." "He is." He signed the final line on the log, dated it, and handed it back. He didn't mention the audit, didn't ask how it was going. He put his phone in his pocket and walked out. She stood at the table for a moment after the cage door closed, looking at where he'd been standing. Dorothy Teal lived on Evangeline Street in a house with a chain-link fence around a yard she kept meticulous since 1989. Flower boxes in the winter, even when there wasn't much blooming, just the bare soil, turned and ready. Her husband had died when Marcus was 9. She worked medical billing for St. Agnes Hospital for 21 years. She drove a 2015 Ford Focus with a Chilean parking sticker on the back bumper that she'd never taken off. Claire didn't know Dorothy. She knew of her the way you know of anyone in a town this size, by proximity and reputation. She'd seen her twice at the courthouse and once at the Piggly Wiggly off Highway 30. She'd seen the Facebook page Dorothy maintained for Marcus, which she updated on his birthday and on the anniversary of his death. She'd seen the comments under each post: "Still praying for you, Dorothy, still here." On Thursday, Claire took a personal day and drove to New Orleans. She took I-10 east and watched the landscape flatten into marsh and then resolve into the city's elevated sprawl as she crossed the Pontchartrain Causeway's on-ramp. The FBI field office on Leon C. Simon Drive was a federal building, concrete and glass flags, a parking lot with painted lines. She sat in the lot for 11 minutes before going in. She'd called ahead and asked for the Civil Rights Division. They'd given her the name of an agent, Priya Varma. Varma met her in the lobby. She was younger than Claire expected, early 30s, maybe, with dark hair pulled back and a gray blazer that was starting to pill at the elbows. She had a lanyard with her credential and a way of listening that was not particularly warm and not unkind. She was the kind of woman who did not fill silence with noise. They sat in a room with a metal table and 2 chairs and a window that looked into the hallway. Claire had brought a folder, printouts of the photographs she'd taken of the Samsung phone, copies of the original evidence intake form for the Teal case, which she was permitted to access because it was her job, and a 1-page timeline she'd typed at her kitchen table on Wednesday night. Varma read everything without interrupting. She flipped back to the inventory form twice. "When you say the Nokia wasn't there, you searched the full box?" "Yes." "Could it have been moved to another box in the series?" "I checked all 9 boxes, logged it on my clipboard. The Nokia is not in any of them." "And the Samsung?" "No intake form, no label, no chain of custody. It's been in a sealed evidence box from an officer-involved shooting case since April 2019. Varma tapped the photo of the Samsung. "You didn't turn it on." "I know better than that." A pause. "Have you told anyone at the department?" "No." "Not your supervisor, there's a supervisor above you." "Captain Thuriot, Evidence and Property Division." "No, I haven't told him." Varma looked at the printout again. "What was your reason for auditing the Teal box? Was it selected randomly?" "No, the new sheriff ordered a full physical audit of all cases from 2018 through 2020, anything where the case status is closed and no litigation is pending. It's a transition audit. She wants to know what's in the room." Varma looked up. "Sheriff Lena Boudreau, she was elected in November, first woman. She came from the DA's office." Varma wrote that down on a notepad she'd produced from nowhere. She wrote in a leftward slant, and Claire noticed her hand was slightly ink-stained near the knuckle of her index finger, which was the kind of thing you noticed about people when you were trying not to look nervous. "Leave all of this with me," Varma said. "The phone stays in your locked drawer. You don't access the Teal box again unless it comes up naturally in the audit, and if it does, you document it and call me." "What if someone asks me about it?" "Document the conversation, date, time, exact words, voice memos if you can do it naturally." "Okay." "Ms. Duvall," Varma waited for her to look up, "you understand this process is slow." "I understand that. It's going to feel like nothing is happening, and then something will happen and it'll move fast." "I understand," Claire said again, and she did, and she went home. Ricky Camo had been moved to administrative duties at the department in the weeks after the Teal shooting, which was standard, and then reinstated to patrol 3 months later, which was also standard, and then quietly transferred to the records division in the fall of 2021, where he now spent his days scanning old paper case files into the department's new digital system. He was 34 years old and had the look of a man in the middle of something he hadn't expected to be in the middle of. Not guilty exactly, or not only guilty. More like a man who had taken a step and found air beneath his foot and has spent every moment since trying not to look down. He worked a cubicle 3 doors from Claire's office. They'd been neighbors in that building sense for 2 years without ever having a real conversation. He sometimes said morning in the hallway, she said it back. Once he'd held the door for her when her hands were full, the ordinary machinery of coexistence. She watched him differently now. He was thin in the way that suggested something eating at him, not illness, just attrition. He brought lunch from home in a paper bag and he ate it at his desk with the headphones in, watching the scanner screen. He never ate in the break room. She noticed that on the wall of his cubicle there was a photograph of 2 kids, probably 4 and 6, in Easter clothes, standing in a yard she didn't recognize. No photograph of a woman. She was not trying to figure out his story, she was just watching. She had learned in this job that watching was not the same as judging. The evidence room taught you that. You received what came in, you cataloged it, you maintained the chain. What it meant was for someone else to decide. You only got in trouble when you confused your role. 3 weeks after her visit to New Orleans, a woman appeared in the front lobby of the department and asked to speak to the sheriff about the Marcus Teal case. Claire heard about it the way she heard most things, through the administrative assistant who shared the break room and who processed the lobby visitor logs. The woman had been Dorothy Teal. She'd arrived on a Tuesday at 10 in the morning with a 3-page letter in a manila envelope and had asked for Sheriff Boudreaux by name. The assistant didn't know if she'd gotten the meeting. Claire ate her lunch and went back to the evidence room. In the 3rd week of March, Varma called from a number that wasn't in Claire's contacts. She said, "The phone had content, some of it's relevant. We're going to need the original Nokia's chain of custody, specifically when it was last verified as present." She paused. "We're also looking at a broader pattern. I can't tell you more than that right now." "Okay," Claire said. "How are you doing otherwise?" "Fine. Anyone asked you anything unexpected?" "No." "Keep documenting." Claire kept documenting. Roy Gaudette had a particular relationship with the parish that was hard to describe from the outside and probably hard to see from the inside. He'd grown up 2 towns over in Maringouin in a family that had nothing. He'd worked a shrimp boat summers through high school and got into law enforcement the way a lot of men from that part of Louisiana did. It was a paycheck, then it became an identity. He was good at it. Not in the flashy way, not in the way that made headlines, in the competent, patient way that keeps an institution functioning year after year. He knew people. He knew what they wanted and what they were afraid of, and he knew how to position himself as neither the problem nor the solution but the necessary element in between. He had been running a protection arrangement with a man named Wallace DeSormo since approximately 2015. DeSormo operated a distribution network for methamphetamine through a network of legitimate businesses: a used car lot, a janitorial supply company, 3 storage facilities, and what Gaudette provided was early warning, tips on plan searches, information on confidential informants, the occasional misdirection in an investigation. He wasn't dirty in the cartoonish way. He didn't take cash in envelopes. The arrangement was more diffuse than that: favors extended, costs managed, dangers signaled. A man like DeSormo didn't stay invisible by paying off cops. He stayed invisible by being useful to them. By paying for the sheriff's re-election campaigns, by employing deputies' relatives, by making donations to the Parish Recreation League. The arrangement was institutional. Gaudette was its custodian. Marcus Teal had worked peripherally in the DeSormo network, one of maybe 40 young men from the parish who did odd jobs without understanding their full context. Pickups, deliveries, holding packages, the kind of work that doesn't look like anything from the outside. Teal was not an important person in the network. He was a node, a small one, easily replaceable. What made him important was the phone. He'd been using it to communicate with someone higher in the network, someone who was, as it would later emerge, a person DeSormo had been trying to identify. An internal problem, a possible informant. The phone contained a thread of text messages between Teal and this person, and when Teal was stopped on Hatcher Road by Jourdain, and the reason for that stop was not random, not a tail light, not a rolling stop. Jourdain had been given Teal's plate number and told to find a reason. The phone was the objective. The shooting had not been planned. That was the thing that made it tragic in the particular way that real tragedy works, through contingency. Jourdain had been told to stop the car and get the phone. He'd been scared. Teal had moved, whether he'd reached for something or simply moved his hands toward his waist in the way a frightened young man might, and Jourdain, who was 28 and had been on patrol for less than 3 years, had fired twice. Center mass. The second shot was unnecessary, medically speaking, but that distinction doesn't survive contact with the law of agency. Gaudette had arrived at the scene 20 minutes after dispatch. He'd spent those 20 minutes on 2 phone calls. He'd found the Nokia in the car, Teal's personal phone, unlocked, nothing incriminating on it, and he'd taken it. He'd placed the Samsung from his jacket pocket, Teal's other phone, the burner, somewhere it could be retrieved without obvious chain of custody issues. The plan had been to retrieve it from the evidence box within a week under the guise of a case review. Something had intervened. He couldn't remember precisely what it had been. The internal investigation had moved faster than he'd expected. The press attention, the politics of it. The window closed, and then the case went cold, and the box sat in the cage on row J, shelf 14 for 4 years and 11 months. Claire Duvall opened it on a Tuesday morning in early March in the flickering light with her box knife and her inventory sheet. The federal warrant came on a Thursday. Claire knew it was coming only because Varma had called the night before and told her to go to work normally, to complete her regular duties, and to stay out of the cage between 9 and 11 a.m. if she could arrange it without drawing attention. She arranged it. She had a backlog of court-ordered inventory requests to process at her desk, which kept her in her office. She heard the arrival not as a commotion exactly, but as an alteration in the building's ambient noise, footsteps that didn't belong to the building's rhythm, voices that were slightly too controlled, doors that opened and stayed open. She looked once through her office window and saw 2 men in jackets that read FBI on the back, moving through the corridor toward the cage. She looked back at her screen. The request from the U.S. Attorney's Office had named the Samsung phone, and the original chain of custody documentation for case 2019-04-CR0882. It had also named in a separate sealed attachment she was not privy to, the electronic communications from Gaudette's department-issued devices, the access logs from the evidence room for April 2019, and a collection of financial records associated with 3 shell entities in the parish. She heard in the afternoon that Gaudette had been placed on administrative leave. The department email from the chief deputy said only, LT. Gaudette will be on administrative leave effective immediately. Further communications will be issued as appropriate. It had the tone of an official statement composed by a committee, which is to say it said everything and nothing. She finished her work day. She drove home. She sat in the carport where she never sat and looked at the yard until it got dark. The interrogation room in the Baton Rouge FBI field office was not like what you saw on television. It was smaller. The ceiling was lower. The chair on the subject's side was slightly uncomfortable without being theatrical about it, just slightly, in the way that all government furniture is slightly wrong for the human body. The recording equipment was not dramatic. A small camera bolted to the wall, a laptop on the table. Gaudette had his attorney with him, a woman named Elspeth Courtauld, 60, who had defended federal criminal cases in Louisiana for 30 years. She wore a navy blazer and red water. She said almost nothing, which was her job. The agent across from Gaudette was not Varma. He was a man named Beauchamp, late 40s, with the kind of face that looked like a closed door. He had a manila folder on the table that he never opened. You were the supervising investigator on the officer-involved shooting of Marcus Teal, April 9, 2019, Beauchamp said. It wasn't a question. Correct. You arrived on scene at approximately 12:07 a.m. That sounds right. You were the senior officer on scene for approximately 40 minutes before the shift commander arrived. That's correct. Beauchamp folded his hands. During that 40 minutes, the scene was under your control. It was a scene in progress, yes. Did you handle any property from the victim's vehicle during that period? Gaudette's jaw shifted. The attorney said nothing. I may have during the initial scene assessment. Evidence is sometimes Did you remove anything from the vehicle? A pause that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. I documented my actions in the investigation report. Beauchamp opened the folder for the first time. He turned a page and slid it across the table without comment. It was a printout of the scene photograph log timestamp photos from 2 department cameras that had been at the scene. In the third photograph, taken at 12:22 a.m. from a patrol car's exterior camera, you could see Gaudet at the passenger window of Teal's vehicle, his right arm inside. Gaudet looked at the photo. His face didn't change much, just a slight compression around the eyes, the involuntary adjustment of a man recalibrating. The scene investigation report, Beauchamp said, does not reference you entering the vehicle or handling any items. Courtauld put her hand on the table. My client will need to review the specific documentation before. I'm not asking for an explanation, Beauchamp said. He said it without heat, which was somehow worse. I'm noting a discrepancy, we'll address it in writing. The Samsung phone contained 112 text messages. 67 of them were between the number registered to Marcus Teal on that device and a contact saved as DW. The forensic analysis of the messages, which took the Digital Crimes Unit in New Orleans 4 weeks to fully analyze and authenticate, established a pattern of communication about scheduled pickups, amounts, and complaints. The last message from DW to Teal, sent 4 hours before the traffic stop, read, "Need the other phone, don't make me ask twice." The contact DW was traced through the carrier records to a prepaid number last topped up at a convenience store in Baton Rouge. The store had exterior surveillance. The footage, degraded, 49 weeks old when the warrant was executed, showed a man using the store's ATM and then the register. He was there for less than 3 minutes. The quality was not good. But forensic image enhancement and a comparison to the DMV database produced a 79% likelihood match to Devin Walcott, 29, an employee of a janitorial supply company registered to a Louisiana LLC, whose articles of incorporation listed one Wallace DeSormo as principal officer. This was, in the way of federal investigations, not the end of the thread but a place to pull. The news broke on a Thursday in April, 13 months after Claire had first opened the box. She heard it from her son, who called from Baton Rouge at 7:15 in the morning while she was drinking coffee and watching the light come up over the neighbor's oak tree. He'd seen it on social media before the news sites had the full story. "Mom, isn't that your department?" "Yes." "The guy they arrested, Gaudet, do you know him?" "I know him." A pause. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, baby." "Like, were you involved in, is this something you knew about?" She thought about what to say. She thought about the flickering light in the cage, the clean stroke of the box knife. She thought about the phone with no label sitting in the far corner of the box. "I do my job," she said, "that's all I can tell you." He stayed on the phone for another minute, worried in the way young men are worried about their mothers, obliquely, without being able to name it. And then he had class and she told him to go, and he went. She turned on the television. The federal indictment named Roy Gaudet on 4 counts: obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, civil rights conspiracy, and 1 count of accessory after the fact to the deprivation of civil rights. It named Wallace DeSormo on 11 counts, including drug trafficking, racketeering, and conspiracy. It named Devin Walcott on 6 counts. It named a former dispatcher, a man Claire had seen in the hallway for 8 years, on 2 counts of unauthorized disclosure of law enforcement information. It did not name Deputy Calvin Jourdain, who had been interviewed 3 times by federal investigators and had provided on the 3rd interview, with his own separate attorney present, a proffer statement. He had not planned to shoot Marcus Teal. He had planned to stop the car, find a reason to search it, and retrieve the phone. He had been terrified and he had fired, and he had spent 4 years and 11 months waking up at 3 in the morning and staring at the ceiling and not being able to explain to himself or anyone else what had happened in that 1 second on Hatcher Road. He was 38 years old, he had 2 daughters, he was not charged. Claire watched the news coverage for 40 minutes and then turned it off. She called Varma. "I saw," Varma said. "Jourdain. There's a separate civil matter Ms. Teal's attorney filed in federal district court. That's not our case." I know I'm not. Claire stopped. I'm not asking you to explain it. Are you all right? I don't know yet. Varma paused. What you did took a long time, and it's going to take longer. The trial won't be fast. I know how this works. People who work in the building sometimes don't realize that what they did is the phone, Claire. Without the phone, we had the financial records, but the connection to the Teal case was circumstantial. You gave us the chain. I did my job. Varma let that sit for a moment. Yes, she said, you did. The department changed in the way that institutions change after a reckoning, incrementally, unevenly, with pockets of genuine reform alongside pockets of nothing at all. Sheriff Boudreau issued a department-wide policy on evidence room audit procedures that made the kind of physical inventory Claire had been conducting mandatory every 18 months rather than at the supervisor's discretion. She hired an outside firm to audit the chain of custody logs from 2015 through 2022. In the break room, people still talked about the weather and high school football and the rising price of everything. The coffee was still bad. The fluorescent light in the evidence cage still flickered twice before it steadied. Captain Thuriot, Claire's supervisor, had been interviewed by the investigators and cleared, which was the truth. He had nothing to do with it, but he developed a slight distance from Claire in the weeks that followed, the way men in institutions sometimes put distance between themselves and the person who'd shaken the building. Not hostility. Just the complicated maintenance of a man who needs to believe he would have done the same thing and can't quite get there. She noticed it and filed it away, and did her work. The trial of Roy Gaudet began on a Wednesday in September in the United States District Court for the Middle District of Louisiana, Baton Rouge Division. It lasted 11 days. The courtroom was not full the way people expected it to be. Federal criminal trials are procedurally dense and slow, and the gallery that had been full on the opening day had thinned to a dedicated contingent by the third. Dorotha Teal was there every day. She sat in the same seat, third row, left side, wearing a different blouse each day with her hands in her lap and her posture so upright it looked effortful. She was not a victim in the federal charges. The Civil Rights Conspiracy Statute allowed for prosecution of the cover-up rather than the shooting itself, which meant the direct emotional truth of what had happened to her son was filtered through legal abstraction, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, conspiracy to obstruct justice. The prosecutor, a young AUSA named Celestine who was meticulous and never dramatic, laid out the case in 3 days of direct evidence, including the authentication of the Samsung phone's content, the camera footage, the financial records, and the testimony of 3 cooperating witnesses from the DeSormo network. Gaudet's attorney argued that the placement of the phone in the evidence box was speculative, that the photograph did not definitively show his hand removing the Nokia, that the connection between his communications with DeSormo and the Teal shooting was a narrative constructed after the fact. It was a competent defense, not a winning one. The jury was out for 2 days and 4 hours. When the 4-person stood to read the verdict, Claire was not in the courtroom. She was in the evidence room at the department doing her inventory. She had submitted a written statement to the federal prosecutors and had been deposed once, but she was not a trial witness. Her name appeared in the public record only once, in the initial warrant application, described as a civilian evidence technician employed by the Dellacroix Parish Sheriff's Department who, in the course of a routine audit, identified and preserved evidence material to this investigation. A civilian evidence technician, 11 years, box knife, inventory sheet. She was sealing a box when her phone buzzed with a news alert. She looked at the screen. Former Dellacroix Parish Sheriff's LT, Roy Gaudet convicted on all 4 federal counts. She set her phone face down on the cart. She finished sealing the box. She wrote the seal number on the inventory log, initialed it, dated it. She put the log in the file. She moved to the next box. The sentencing was in December, gray and cold enough that the herons had moved away from the bayou's edge. Gaudet received 14 years. He stood at the defense table and listened to the judge with his hands clasped in front of him. His face was the face of a man who had spent a long time being certain and was now, for the first time in a long time, not certain of anything, not defiant, not broken, just altered in a way that would take a long time to finish. DeSormo received 22 years. Dorotha Teal had submitted a victim impact statement that the AUSA read into the record because Dorotha declined to read it herself. It was 2 pages, single-spaced, and it described Marcus Teal, his handwriting, which was bad, his laugh, which was sudden and surprising, the way he'd call her every Sunday evening from school no matter what. It did not describe her grief. It didn't have to. Claire read about it in The Advocate the next morning over her coffee. The light was coming in at a low angle through the kitchen window, catching the dust in the air and making it visible for a moment before the angle shifted and it disappeared again. She had a voicemail from Devlin checking in, telling her about a study group he'd joined for the LSAT. She listened to it twice. In the background, she could hear the particular noise of a college library, murmured voices, the mechanical click of a laptop keyboard, someone dropping something soft on a hard floor. She put her cup in the sink and rinsed it. She picked up her keys. She drove to work. One afternoon in February, on her way back from the copy room, she passed the lobby and through the glass front doors she saw Dorothy Teal standing in the parking lot. She wasn't coming in. She was standing by a Ford Focus with a Chilean sticker on the bumper looking at the building. She had on a winter coat that seemed too thin for the day, and she was standing the way people stand when they've driven somewhere and aren't sure if they should have come. Claire watched her for a moment through the glass. Then she pushed the door open and walked out. The cold surprised her. She hadn't grabbed her jacket. The parking lot was half empty at this hour. Dorothy turned when she heard the door and their eyes met and neither of them spoke for a second. Up close, Dorothy was smaller than she seemed in photographs, or maybe it was that grief had a way of compressing people in ways you couldn't photograph. "You don't know me," Claire said. "I know who you are." Claire nodded. Dorothy looked at the building behind her, the sheriff's department seal on the facade, the 2 flags hanging slack in the still air. "I drive out here sometimes," Dorothy said. "I don't know why, I don't know what I think it does." "I don't know either," Claire said. It wasn't the right thing or the wrong thing. It was just the true thing, and Dorothy seemed to recognize it, and her shoulders dropped a fraction, not release, not relief, just the slight lowering of something that had been held very high for a very long time. They stood there for a moment in the pale February light, 2 women in a parking lot outside a building that had done them both damage in different ways and at different scales, and neither of them found anything to add to that. Then Dorothy opened her car door. She got in. She sat for a moment with the door still open, looking at the steering wheel. "He used to call me every Sunday," she said, "not to Claire or to the air." Then she pulled the door shut. Claire stood in the cold parking lot and watched the Ford Focus back out and turn onto Beaumont Street and disappear. She stood there for a while after it was gone. A bird landed on the hood of someone's truck across the lot and looked at her and then looked away. She went back inside. She had work to do. End.